The doctrine of discovery is the current system of laws and policies that justify the removal of land from indigenous peoples. These laws are rooted in church doctrines that originated in the 15th century.
Together, we will uncover this deep structure of colonization that systematically deprives indigenous peoples of human rights.
I'm Sherry Hostetler, and I hope to start a coalition of Anabaptist people of faith that seek to dismantle the doctrine of discovery. I'm also a Mennonite pastor in San Francisco.
And I'm Sarah Augustine, and I also helped start this coalition. As an activist and scholar, I'm the descendant of the Tewa people and a displaced person. This is the Dismantling the Doctrine of Discovery podcast.
We are pleased today to have Jonathan Smucker and Tim Nafziger as our guests on this podcast. Jonathan Smucker has worked for over 25 years as a political organizer, campaigner, and strategist. He is the co-founder of Popular Comms Institute, PA Stands Up, Lancaster Stands Up, Common Defense, Beyond the Choir, and Mennonite Action. He is a PhD candidate in sociology at the University of California, Berkeley, and author of Hegemony How-To, a roadmap for radicals, a book I highly recommend.
Tim Nafziger lives in the Ventura River watershed on the traditional lands of the Chumash people in Southern California. He has been organizing for peace and justice in Mennonite communities for 27 years. He enjoys writing, board games, and photography, and works professionally as a digital marketing consultant. Welcome, both of you. So wonderful to have you here.
Yeah, our compatriots in the struggle. It's lovely to have you here. Well, Jonathan, I am wondering if you can tell us about the origin story of Mennonite Action. A lot of our listeners aren't Mennonite and are not in the Anabaptist world, and so they won't know what Mennonite Action is, possibly.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Sarah and Sherry. So happy to be with you today and having this conversation. I think, Mennonite Action's origin story will sound different coming from different folks who were involved in co-founding it. Probably the most comprehensive version you're going to get is from the two original staff members, Nick Martin or Adam Raymer. But I was involved and can tell you from my own perspective. And to me, part of the conversation about Mennonite Action was a very, very long conversation that folks like Nick Martin and my wife, Becca Rast, and I have had. I feel like Tim and I over the years have sometimes had elements of this conversation. And that is a conversation about, well, let me put it this way. I've been a political organizer for 30 years. I've worked on many different issues and social movements. In recent years, I've done electoral work. I often meet other folks who were raised Mennonite, and I'll say a little bit about what that is in this work, but I don't find out until later that they're Mennonite. And I've marveled before over how there's a lot of Quakers you'll meet in this work, or Catholics, or Jews, or folks from other specific faith or denominations, some of which, like Quakers or Catholics, have vehicles that enable young people who want to take action to do that political action as a Quaker, as a Catholic. And Mennonites, in my own experience, have mostly had, and I know this is changing, right? But they've mostly had vehicles for service work or humanitarian work, but not necessarily for, it's like we went out as individuals and did the public protest, political confrontation work. And in fact, so to answer the part about what is a Mennonite, one of the features, and this is uneven and it's not all or nothing, it's an overgeneralization, but one feature of Mennonites over the past 3 centuries in North America, Mennonites are often described as the quiet in the land. Now that's been changing, but there's a lot in that. There is a lot around abstentionism from politics, and there's a lot to dig into there. But for whatever reason, myself, people like Tim, people like my wife Becca Rast, people like Nick Martin, Adam Raymer, there's things in the Mennonite upbringing, social justice values, peace values, collectivism, internationalism, kind of like not having a patriotic bone in our body on some level, to put it dramatically, that have led us into this work, that have influenced us in this work, but there weren't vehicles to do that. So we've been thinking about that. And when this moment happened, October 7th, and the horrific attacks, and those of us who have worked on the issue of Palestine or paid attention to Palestine, Israel for years, just knew intuitively this was going to be very bad, and this was going to be really severe. And we're seeing the bombings, we're seeing the devastation over the first couple of weeks following October 7th, and we're like, is this a moment? It seemed to us there are a lot of Mennonites, because Mennonites have had a history in Palestine and Israel institutionally, and also just were people in the United States and in Canada who are paying attention to this and are heartbroken over what we're seeing, the images we're seeing in our Instagram feeds, etc. Is this a moment where we could pull the trigger and create a way of Mennonites showing up as Mennonites, and on some level, I guess I would say, organize our people to show up in this moment, and to have it not just be the kind of individual self-selectors who are comfortable with protest and who have a whole history of activism, but can we penetrate more deeply into our congregations and bring people with us, including people who have never been to a protest before? So those were some of the questions that got us thinking, and ultimately to call for a mass call. It was in November, of Mennonites for a ceasefire. And there were about 1,000 people on that call, and it was very well organized. And that was it, right? That was how we hit the ground running. I think, Adam and Nick in particular did a lot of great work of reaching out to people in the Mennonite church who had a history on working on Palestine, folks in MCC, people like Amy McLaughlin Yoder, who reached out to other people. And I do think that there were a bunch of questions at the beginning from people who've worked on this, like, who are these people? Is this, in retrospect, it was pretty bold to call something Mennonite Action, and not ask anybody's permission for that, right? And I think from what I heard afterward, because I'm doing interviews with folks, there were a number of people who, when they heard about the call, in between that and the call, were like skeptical. Who are these people? Are they capable? Is this going to go anywhere? Skeptical about Mennonites showing up politically. But the call was very well organized, and it was a really important space. And ever since then, people were like, okay, this is happening. We're going to show up. And a movement and an organization has come out of it. I've gone on long enough, so there's a lot more to say about the origins, but I'll stop there for now.
Well, Tim, you're very involved with both the Coalition to Dismantle the Doctrine of Discovery, and Mennonite Action. And I wonder, where do you see the overlap in your work with both movements?
Well, I think that Jonathan described the origins of the Mennonite Action very well. I think it's worth noticing some of the similarities and differences with the origins of the coalition. So I was at the founding gathering at Sherry's Church at First Mennonite in 2014 of the coalition. I think it's safe to say it came out of pastors, leaders, scholars, and organizers within the Mennonite Church who had been working for a long time around the different issues, and said, we need to do work around Indigenous solidarity to look at the root issues. And came alongside movements like Idle No More. And Sarah, your work in Suriname with Indigenous people impacted by gold mining. And I think it's worth noting that both organizations at their root are looking at genocide, and genocide is rooted in white supremacy and supremacy more broadly. And that's, I think, has been an opportunity to challenge some of the patterns in Mennonites more broadly that have looked at peace without wanting to talk about justice or white supremacy specifically. For me, one of the moments around that was seeing the Unite the Right rally and in 2017 in Charlottesville, and specifically the Mennonite response, which some Mennonites were like really focused first on their perceptions of quote unquote violence on both sides rather than looking at white supremacy as a root issue there. That was a couple of years after the founding of the coalition, but I really see the coalition as grappling with those issues very directly and explicitly. Sarah, you and I have talked about this idea of justice, not just talking about access. And I think access is important, but Mennonite church institutional responses have sometimes focused a lot more on access. But the differences are also interesting, I think, that that Jonathan alluded to in terms of Mennonite Action, the catalyst being people who had decades of experience working outside Mennonite context, and in some ways were coming home. And I think, Jonathan, your book, Hegemony How-To, really challenges people to work to organize their own community, the idea of organizing versus activist. And I think Mennonite Action responds to that in a way that's actually, the coalition is the one space that I've seen in the Mennonite Church USA context more broadly where that has been happening, like organize our own people. And then both the coalition and Mennonite Action have found when you organize Mennonites, there's lots of other people for the coalition recently. That's been the Episcopalian Church, people from other traditions saying this is an opportunity as people of faith. And Mennonite Action has also had those opportunities in the last year and a half. One more thing I'd say about Mennonite Action is I think it's important to mention the momentum model that the Ine Institute, Carlos Saavedra, and Paul Engler and Mark Engler have talked about, that comes out of these moments of the whirlwind, where Nick and Adam put out a call for a Zoom call in November of 2023, and 800 Mennonites from 250 congregations showed up. Whereas I think the coalition has worked on more traditional community organizing models that have just grown more slowly and also deeply. And those both are powerful models. In the momentum model, it's really important to have story, strategy, and structure in place when you have that moment of the whirlwind. And I think groups like Christian Peacemaker Teams and the coalition and other groups have been organizing in different ways in these spaces for decades. And so when Nick and Adam put out that call, those 800 people, this was not new to them. It was really catalyzing the Mennonite story. And I think it's worth noticing those similarities and differences.
So I wanted to just point out at this point that we co-authored a paper together. And I think it would be fun to just kind of talk through that. And if you'll let me sort of process here for a minute, I'm getting ready to go to Amsterdam to the Believers Conference where I'm a plenary speaker. And the question that they asked me to talk about is the radical Reformation. Is it radical enough? And, Tim, we know each other well. You know how I'm going to respond to that. Based on some of the things that you've already said. But I wonder if the two of you would walk us through this paper that we co-authored that's really laying some of that out. Like, where is the radical edge? Because, I would speak for myself. I don't have any interest in becoming radical to be a radical. I want justice for my people. And I'm desperate for it. Justice for my people, for real. I mean, I want, Jonathan Oltworth, this amazing activist and holy man, a Lakota leader, says, my people want to live. That's the prayer. My people want to live. And for me, that's it. I'm motivated by that day and night. So that's for me what sort of the radical origin. I am radical for the survival of my people and justice for my people. And so anyway, I wonder, just sort of holding that Anabaptism at 500 question that was posed to me, the radical Reformation, are we radical enough? I wonder if you
I
could.
want to. I just want to add real quickly for our non-Anabaptist listeners that Anabaptist at 500, we are celebrating the 500th anniversary of the founding of the Anabaptist movement this year, from which the Mennonite Church came, and it's a big deal for Anabaptists, and that's why we're talking about ourselves. Well, we like to talk about ourselves a lot anyway. But that's why we're talking about ourselves and our history and who we are in our identity even more. I'm not talking about us. I'm talking about the larger Anabaptist world. So
I think that the paper responds well to this question. So, Tim, I want to just wonder, and Jonathan, if you'd walk us through it.
Yeah, why don't you take it first, Tim?
So in the paper, one of the key points we want to make is highlighting that this is the 500th anniversary of a very specific event. George Blaurock and Felix Mons in this attic in January 1525 in the Mennonite high school I was brought up in. That was the thing that was hammered into my brain. That's the moment. But there's actually a much broader Anabaptist movement that was happening in this period, and I think that's part of the story we can tell that looks at, as you said, Sarah, the word radical can be thrown around a lot, but what was really happening in this period was deep longing for justice in the face of corrosive grievances and deep injustice
Mm.
happening in Europe around this region. The Peasants' War or the Peasants' Movement, depending on how you talk, and Thomas Munzer in 1524 are part of that story as well. And Mennonites have tended to tell the story in a very narrow way, and we look at why that is. I mean, H.S. Bender's Anabaptist vision was, I would say, in service of two things. One was trying to justify and support conscientious objectors in the time when he was living, which is understandable. That was a real motivator for Mennonite political involvement in the 1930s and 40s. But also, I would say, to be blunt, assimilation, to like say we're legitimate. Mennonites were peculiar. We still are peculiar, and we've been ambivalent about that peculiar identity. And I think having to talk about Thomas Munzer and the city of Munster 10 years later, what happened there has always been, I would almost say, painful for many Mennonites because it's an embarrassing part of our story. And so this paper is, we're attempting to grapple with that. And there's a companion piece that I wrote for Anabaptist Leader called Beyond Blaurock, which is just focused on this idea. And Vincent Harding, I think, is a key part of looking at that. Maybe we can talk more about Harding in a minute. But I think as we look at that broader Anabaptist story on the 500th anniversary, it's a chance to say, no, that's not the only story from our history, and we need to look at all of that. And Menno Simons was important because he was a survivor, and in many ways he was rejecting the violence of Thomas Munzer and the uprising in Munster. Most confusing.
So, Tim, I wonder if you can break that down. Many of the people who are listening are not scholars. This is not a podcast for scholars; it's for ordinary people. So most people won't know that story. I wonder if you could briefly just kind of summarize it.
Yeah, both movements were Anabaptists saying we've been treated badly for a long time, and the church is part of that. Thomas Munzer, the Peasants' War, groups of peasants around Germany rose up and then were brutally suppressed. It was so Martin Luther was the person whose 95 Theses were the trigger event for the Reformation more broadly. And people started reading the Bible and saying, okay, this is something, there's these ideas of justice in here that are very different than the way the strict hierarchy and command and control system that we've been living under. The peasants, so the German princes were supporting Luther. That's why he survived. But when people at the grassroots started challenging the power structure itself and the economies, within months Luther switched and began publishing pamphlets saying no, and disowning the peasants. So that's the first. That's the Thomas Munzer and the Peasants' War is a common term for that in 1523, 1524, 1525, happening right at the time that Blaurock and others are meeting in January 1525. That was the wider context. Now, they were not advocating violence, and that's a key difference. But then 10 years later, in the city of Munster in 1535, you have Anabaptists with similar goals, gradually taking over the city of Munster. That one was especially apocalyptic in the sense of unveiling. People were having visions, very much in their understanding the Holy Spirit speaking to them. And they held the city for a year before they were just crushed by the princes and the bishops. And both of those stories have I think it's safe to say Mennonite leaders in the last 100 years have largely distanced themselves by just saying those aren't us, rather than saying there's a history here that we need to grapple with.
Yeah, I would add, well, one, Sarah, I'll see you in Amsterdam. I haven't looked at the program yet, so I didn't realize you were going. I'm actually doing a session that is related to the paper that we wrote together. So it'll be great to meet in person. And first on your question of radical, I really agree with you, Sarah, that like the point is to do justice. The point is not to be a radical. And I mean, I say this as somebody who has radical in the subtitle of my book, but my publisher made me do that. I had a better subtitle, I swear. And there's actually a lot to unpack there, just about like, let them call us radicals, I think is what I would say. But there is I think one of the most remarkable things about Mennonite Action is penetrating deeper into the Mennonite church. So it's not just the problem with a label like radical or activist or anything like that is that in our current society, it becomes this kind of small group of people. I call it the story of the righteous few, where like, oh, I'm a radical. And it's like, okay, the Mennonite church I go to, like there's the usual suspect kind of radical who we know gets up every morning and, makes the announcement about X, Y, or Z cause. Or maybe the church's involvement extends a little bit more to like the handful of people who self-select for the Peace and Social Concerns Committee, right? And that's sometimes the low plateau that not just Mennonites, a lot of churches and denominations across the country over the past 40, 50 years have retracted into that kind of small model or a grass tops model where it's like they just mobilize the pastors of the churches to do things. But we have no collective practice. And sometimes those identifiers like the radical, I think, can fill the space of like, oh, that's the church activist, that's the church radical. I'm not like that, So I like to challenge people to not have it be about that identity, but to be about the work, about the outcomes, about the relationships. I would just add to what Tim said about I think this is maybe just restating what you said, Tim, in my own words. I hope it's adding something. But I was raised with a similar thing where it's like I read church history and it seemed like, what Tim said, people had the printing press, so they're reading the Bible for themselves. The version that I was presented growing up, very Mennonite, going to Mennonite church a few times a week, going to Mennonite elementary school and high school, having both Bible class and then high school church history class, was these folks read the Bible and they saw that there was no basis in the Bible for infant baptism. So strongly did they think that this particular faith ritual, mattered to be done in this particular way spelled out in the Bible, that thousands of them were willing to face jail, torture, and death over this. And so that always seemed a little bizarre to me. Like, did this particular thing matter that much? The political context that Tim said matters tremendously. The one book I read about this, I'm not a history scholar, I'm a sociologist, but it basically said that you can understand the peasant uprising of Munster, of Thomas Munster and other folks without understanding Anabaptism, but you can't understand Anabaptism without understanding the peasant uprising, where 100,000 people were killed horrifically. This was the backdrop, and the movement was for, it was a challenge to feudalism. It was for a more equal distribution of wealth and power. It was, scripture was so much woven into the demands and the movement participants' self-understandings. And so Anabaptism comes kind of on its heels, and in that context, and it's not just the way I was raised about Anabaptism, about we're going to be baptized as adults, not as infants. It almost seemed like we're trying to carry out our faith, and then the state is saying you can't do it that way and interfering. But it was an intervention. It wasn't just trying to practice faith privately. It was a understood by the people doing it as a challenge to the religious authorities and the political authorities. It was understood that way. It was intended that way. It was part of a larger rejection of the hierarchy of the church at the time, and power concentrations. People were being killed for, along with infant baptism, for saying things like, quote, the Pope ought not have so much power. And that was the context. And so part of what we were trying to do is bring Mennonites, many of whom, we've been coming out of this for a long time. And I, Tim mentioned Vincent Harding, very important person to look up, involved in the civil rights movement, wrote King's, militarism speech, Vietnam War speech, was a Mennonite pastor in Chicago, black Mennonite pastor, really was a prophet, was ahead of his time in many ways, was arguing for the Mennonite church to be a front light, not a rear light, kind of cleaning up the mess after wars and conflicts, but to be a front light, to be out there and vocal and visible and being part of the social justice struggles of the time, the civil rights movement, the anti-imperialism movement. This was in the 1960s. So we're basically saying, let's keep going in that direction. Let's reckon with this period of quiet in the land and an articulation of non-resistant theology. That language is in Menno Simons, the founder. But an interpretation of that means a total abstention from politics. Let's wrestle with how that's always been hypocritical, that Mennonite communities have weighed into politics on matters that affect the community. And let's take a greater responsibility for our place in this social, political, economic system, where we're no longer feudal subjects. We're political citizens, most of us in the United States and Canada, the Mennonite Action movement. Let's take responsibility for that and our place in the global order. And let's be involved just like we were being involved. Let's work to shape the future, not just to, practice our faith in, under a bushel, as the scripture says.
So, Jonathan, I want to go back to something you said about infant baptism. And I want to just talk about that for a moment in the context of Native Americans here in North America. The understanding of being baptized was a function of assimilation. It was saying that you were now you were named and could be counted. So that meant that you could, first of all, be known to the federal government to be snatched into boarding schools, but it also meant that you could receive an allotment, or conversely, that you might not receive an allotment or any treaty defined goods. So that is to say, Indigenous people created contracts, which we call treaties, with the federal government. In their seceding of lands, they were giving up land. They were given annuities as a result of that. And some of those were paid in commodities, some in cash, some in land and allotments. And if you weren't baptized, there was the threat that you would not be able to have access to those things. So I want to put infant baptism in a really clear context of what that meant for my people, because of course there were Indigenous people who refused to be baptized. They refused for their children to be baptized and were willing to suffer the consequences for that. And again, this is really a function of saying, we have no desire to be assimilated. We don't want to be counted by the state. We don't want to be in the mainstream. We have our own spirituality and life ways. And to not be baptized was almost, I mean, I guess I'm saying this, it could be dramatic in this moment. It was almost like being undocumented. Well, you were not documented. I mean, documentation, legitimacy was tied to baptismal records in the times of settlement, and so not having that record was a profound choice to choose to not be baptized, or for your child to not be baptized. And so I guess I'm thinking through that lens and thinking about early Anabaptists and the rejection of infant baptism. It's more than just sort of a religious conviction. At least in the context of my people, it's stepping away from assimilation itself.
Yeah.
I think in both cases, you're talking about baptism being used by the state for very nefarious and some political ends, I think is what I see as the common thread there. And Jonathan, go ahead. You were about to say something.
Yeah, this is similar to what you're saying, Sherry. I wish that we had a more of a culture among Mennonites and Anabaptists over the past this period of quiet in the land of Mennonites, where Mennonites could have seen an affinity with that refusal that you're talking about, Sarah, because there is an affinity, right? There are obviously there are differences as well, right? Very particular differences and important ones. But there are some things with the refusal. The reason the refusal for baptism was a threat to the state. Baptism was used for purposes of census, for taxation, for military conscription, right? It would be like if there was a movement today to not register your kids with the state. And I hear some of those implications with what you're saying, Sarah. And so, I wish that the kind of Christian centrism and some of wouldn't have clouded so much of the view of Mennonite Church, where instead of seeing it as like, oh, they're rejecting Christ and Christianity, would have seen an affinity in that refusal with Mennonites' ancestors' refusal to have the state baptize children, because so much based on that was it should be about a choice, a free choice.
I wish we had the time and it was appropriate for us to have that conversation now. Oh, Jonathan, we're going to have that conversation in Amsterdam. I have so many responses to that, but I don't want to just carry us
love to
on Christian centerism why wasn't that affinity sought? Yeah, that's a crucial question.
Yeah. Well, clearly we could have parts 1, 2, and 3 of this podcast, as I'm realizing as we're going along. But I will say the last question that we knew we wanted to ask you, there might come out more here, but for both or either of you, I think we're already getting to this, but what about Anabaptism motivated the work about social and systemic change? And what about Anabaptism, in your view, hasn't motivated this work? And again, as we said, it might be interesting to think of how this might be true within other Christian traditions as well, since many of our listeners won't be from Anabaptist background. But what is there in Anabaptism that draws people toward that work? And what about Anabaptism has actually pushed people away from that work of social and systemic change?
Yeah, I can share some of my own story here. Jonathan, you talked about growing up in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, in a Mennonite community. That was the community I grew up in until I was 12, in a pretty traditional Mennonite church, River Corner Mennonite, where when I was growing up, older men and women still sat on opposite sides of the congregation. The older folks dressed plain, as we say, which meant plain suit for men and cape and a covering for women. And then when I was 12, moved to Goshen, Indiana, which had a very different expression of Mennonite understanding, which was much more centered around these ideas of peace and social justice. And that was where I did have, I'm realizing it was pretty local to where I was at, but my mom joined a group called Christian Peacemaker Teams, now Community Peacemaker Teams, in the late 90s. And there was a regional group there of people doing public witness and public action. In that situation, it was around the lead up to the Iraq War, but also in the late 90s, immigration raids that was happening in factories in Goshen, and protesting militarism, and driving down to the School of the Americas when I was in high school, where there was thousands of Christians crossing the line to protest the violence of the U.S. government in Central America and killing thousands of supporting dictatorships, killing thousands of political dissidents. And so those were I found an expression of Anabaptism and being Mennonite that was rooted in this tradition. And so that's a large part of what kept me engaged in the Mennonite tradition for the last 25 years. But I think some of the issues that you've already mentioned, like the myth of the righteous few, when I read your book, Jonathan, I was like, oh, this is a real challenge for Mennonites who can sometimes just do things because it's right or it's faithful. The phrase that John Howard Yoder used was worrying more about faithfulness than effectiveness. And that book was really influential for me in high school to understand my own tradition. But I think we have to name that Yoder's abuse and systematic harassment of women was disastrous for Mennonite organizing, especially in Goshen and Elkhart area where I grew up. And I don't think we can underestimate how those kind of actions really had an impact on the Mennonite voice. When you have this person held up on a pillar as, hey, this is someone helping us understand ourselves, while at the same time really harming a lot of women around him, and in that really impacting a whole generation of Mennonite leadership. And so those are the kind of complexities for me that are part of my story growing up in both Lancaster and Goshen, and I think are true for a lot of young Mennonites growing up in our period, and who are now, more now middle-aged. And so that's from a kind of personal story angle how I think about those things.
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, for me, I grew up pretty conservative Mennonite in Lancaster County, and I thought I grew up reading the Bible because I was given Bible memory verses my whole life. A lot of my politicization was from reading the Bible for myself when I was around 15 and seeing all the stuff about social and economic justice and feeling disillusioned actually with my Mennonite community. And it was complex because I both felt, let me talk about the disillusionment quickly first. I felt like I had been inspired by the courage of the Anabaptists. And in fact, as I became politicized in high school, which was a combination of reading the Bible, being like, oh, if God cares so much about justice, I should learn about justice in my time. And so I started going to Mennonite Central Committee's Alternative Resource Library. They're located in Lancaster County, and reading about the global economy and about imperialism and just kind of educating myself in this way. And so I was both disillusioned with what I saw as the kind of acquiescence and of the community I was from, and also drawing on the history as a source of courage, of understanding that like I was part of a people who had stood up for what they believed to be right at a cost of death and torture and persecution, and lived through that. And so it was complex for me. And I left high school. I dove in. I joined the Catholic Worker Movement, a radical, liberation theology based movement, for a couple of years, and then that was my transition for a while out of Christianity. And this gets to the question of what in it hasn't, shaped my work in social movements. Is I got involved with the American Indian movement, the Madeo Wakantan Dakota community in Minneapolis, and then the Dene in Arizona, and I was dealing with, the kind of anti-earth, anti-indigenous culture, anti-women stuff that has been loaded into the history of Christianity. And I became a lot more like disillusioned in a way of of looking at both how it's harmed my own internal psyche and the world. And then I kind of swung back from that. I mean, I still hold that. That's really shaped me. But I also came to appreciate some of the things that were still part of the community, the Anabaptist community that I was raised in, that might not have been the top elements, but like there was strong mutual aid. There was a lot of, reciprocal generosity outside of a money economy, non-materialism, values of peace. My dad in prayers every night, prayed for people all around the world. And so there was an internationalism baked in. Who spoke at our church, even in a conservative congregation, where, I learned about Palestine on some level at an early age. So that's my answer.
Well, thank you. Is there anything more that needs to be said as we're getting towards the end of this podcast? Tim, did you want to mention something about other ways for folks to check out the work of Vincent Harding?
Yeah, I think I'd really recommend. So we talked a lot about. We just mentioned how Harding was really engaging and challenging Mennonites in the early '60s, working with Dr. King. Towards the end of his life, he engaged. He was always engaging with Mennonites, individual Mennonites throughout his life. I think it's important to say. I'd recommend Joanna Shank's interview with Harding. That's called "The Movement Makes Us Human," and also Tobin Miller Shear's upcoming biography of Harding. I feel like Harding's prophetic work is being rediscovered by a new generation of Mennonites, and has been being rediscovered over the last 15, 20 years. And that's an important part of our story. Having worked for a decade, really been involved with Christian peacemaker teams for over 20 years, the story that we focused on, which is an important one, was from the Mennonite World Conference in 1984, where
Ron Sider.
Ron Sider, yes, let me start over there. So one of the important stories that I grew up within the Christian peacemaker context was Ron Sider in 1984 talking to Mennonite World Conference and saying, "What if Christians took the same risk for peace that soldiers do for war?" And didn't learn the story of Harding a decade earlier at the Mennonite World Conference, the same gathering, really challenging Mennonites to listen to the stories and experiences of Black revolutionaries and learn from them as people committed to nonviolence. And so that was a very selective narrative that I think we can really revisit. And I think that as someone who's been involved with the coalition, Harding's work really speaks to some of the key values of the coalition as well. His challenges to look at justice are absolutely as relevant and important to indigenous solidarity and dismantling the doctrine of discovery as to the Black freedom struggles.
Thank you for that, Tim. And thanks to both of you, Jonathan and Tim, for being here today, for the work you're doing, the work we are doing in partnership with each other. It's so good to have allies and people like you involved in the same struggle together. And I'm very grateful also to the three of you for this article that you wrote, that there will be lots of links to all of the things we've been mentioning in the show notes, including that article.
So
Anything else,
I
Sarah?
want to plug that the name of the article is "Give Us the Courage to Enter the Song." It's an Anabaptist Witness. I also wanted to say, this was an awesome conversation. So grateful for the opportunity to connect. I would be remiss if I didn't say our connection to Mennonite Action is related to decolonization and the work of decolonization. That's the central focus of our work in the Coalition to Dismantle the Doctrine of Discovery. And we stand in true solidarity with our kindred in Palestine as they struggle under the weight of settler colonialism, this hegemony that we both struggle to survive. So good to be with you all. Thank you.
Great to be with you. Thank you so much for the invitation and this conversation.
I really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.
This podcast is hosted by us, co-produced by the Coalition to Dismantle the Doctrine of Discovery and Anabaptist World.
The opinions expressed here are ours, however, and do not reflect official positions of Anabaptist World.
For more information, go to anabaptistworld.org and dismantlediscovery.org.
Our theme music is by Micah Peplow and Shannon Kaler. Thank you.